As we are holding short of runway 26, we can now set our takeoff trim. To do this, we can click the Centre of Gravity Standard Mean Chord button on the EFB. This will automatically set our elevator trim for takeoff. We can now also press the Config Check button to check that the aircraft is in the correct configuration for takeoff. Note the parking brake needs to be disengaged for this test. We can now press the cabin call button on the overhead panel to inform the cabin crew that we are ready for takeoff.
Cabin crew, please take your seats for takeoff.
Once we receive verbal confirmation from the cabin crew that the cabin is secured, we can move the cabin secured card on the aft centre console to the cabin secured for takeoff position.
Cabin is secure.
We can now turn on the landing lights and strobe lights. We can now check that the controls are unlocked by clicking on the hand wheel microphone on the central pillar of the control wheel. And we can check that the elevator, ailerons and rudder all have full and unrestricted movement. Note the 146 uses servo tab operated controls for the ailerons and elevators, so when moving the yoke you will only see the servo tabs move rather than the actual control surface. We can now release the parking brake and taxi onto the runway, lining up with the runway centre line and then coming to a stop. As the initial climb is quite a high workload part of the flight, we thought it would be best to explain the initial climb procedure before we take off. So if you imagine a runway, we will firstly climb with our TMS set to takeoff mode up to an altitude of 1,500 feet, and we will do this at our V2 plus 10 speed of 143 knots. At 1500 feet, we will push the nose down, engage sync mode on the TMS, reduce our power to 88%, and accelerate to 177 knots, which is our final takeoff speed and the point at which we will retract the flaps. Being careful not to exceed our flap limit speed, we will accelerate with flaps up to 210 knots, at which point we will engage indicated airspeed mode of the autopilot, at which point the aircraft will continue to climb at 210 knots. We will continue to climb up until 10,000 feet, at which point we will engage sync mode on the autopilot and push the nose down to again increase our speed, and once we get to 250 knots we will disengage the sync mode and the aircraft will continue to climb at 250 knots up until our target altitude today of 24,000 feet. Now let's talk about climb thrust settings. As we touched on earlier, the 146 doesn't have an auto throttle, so we have to manually adjust our throttle lever positions to maintain our correct climb thrust settings. We mentioned earlier that our initial climb thrust is 88% N1, which is correct for the outside air temperature that we are departing with. A general rule of thumb is to use a thrust setting of 88% N1 between 0 and 5,000 feet, and then increase your N1 by 1% for every 5,000 feet of altitude. So we will use 89% N1 between 5 and 10,000 feet, and 90% N1 from 10 to 15,000 feet. With that in mind, let's put all that into practice. Now we know our departure, I'm going to hide the EFB by clicking on the compass deviation card. Now I'm going to hold the brakes and increase our thrust levers to about 55% N1. Using the engine instruments, we now need to check that all the engines are stable, and then we can smoothly advance our thrust levers to approximately set our N1 according to the bugs that we set previously. With thrust set, we can release the brakes and keep the aircraft running down the centre line by using small rudder inputs.
Speed arrive both sides. 80 knots cross-checked. V1. Rotate. V2. Positive rate of climb, gear up.
As we're airborne, we're going to continue to climb at our V2 plus 10 speed, which today is 143 knots. For now, we will continue to hand fly the aircraft and hold the runway heading of 263 degrees. At 1,500 feet, we will engage sync mode on the TMS and start to reduce our throttles to our initial climb power of 88% N1. We will now also reduce our pitch rate to start accelerating to our final takeoff speed and flap retraction. We can now engage the autopilot using the button on the centre console, and we can engage vertical speed mode. So the autopilot is now flying our assigned heading and at our current vertical speed. As we pass our final takeoff speed, we will select flaps up. As we are gaining speed now, we can now engage the autopilot sync mode as to not exceed our maximum flap speed. We can now also begin our turn towards the Guernsey VOR. We can now set our heading bug to 300 degrees to intercept our inbound radial to the Guernsey VOR. As we pass through our initial climb speed of 210 knots, we can engage indicated airspeed mode. The aircraft will now manage to pitch automatically to climb at this speed. As we're now getting closer to our inbound radial to the Guernsey VOR, we can now engage VOR localizer mode on the autopilot panel. The aircraft will now turn and intercept our inbound radial to the Guernsey VOR. We can now carry out our after takeoff and climb checks. We can confirm that the gear and flaps are fully up and retracted. We can now set the forward engine air switches to on and then switch off the APUA. We can then switch off the AC pump and PTU. We can then shut down the APU by moving the master switch to stop. Now we are in a stable climb, we can also allow the cabin crew to begin their duties by pressing the cabin call button on the overhead panel.
Cabin crew has released the general call. I think that the seatbelt function set off.
Passing through 10,000 feet, we can switch off the landing lights and fasten seatbelt signs.
Master switch off. Rotation sign.
and we can increase our climb speed to 250 knots. To do this, you can use the autopilot sync mode to reduce our pitch angle. Once our indicated airspeed has reached 250 knots, we can then disengage sync mode and the aircraft will then climb at the newly assigned speed. As we are approaching the Guernsey VOR, we can now pre-select our next VOR, the Southampton VOR. We can now move the act/pre switch to the pre position and then use the frequency selector knob to select 113.35, the frequency for the Southampton VOR. Once we are within 5 nautical miles of the Guernsey VOR, we can sync the heading book to our current heading and engage heading mode. Using the flip button on the VHF Nav1 radio, we can flip the Southampton VOR into the active slot. We can then select the inbound course to the Southampton VOR, which is 030 degrees, and then pre-select VOR localizer mode. The autopilot will now intercept and hold the course to the Southampton VOR. As we have reached our cruising altitude of 24,000 feet, the aircraft is levelled off and is holding the altitude. Now, as we explained earlier, the 146 does not have auto throttle, only the thrust management system, so the airspeed has to be constantly monitored to ensure that we are at our correct cruise speed. On the first officer's panel, we can now confirm that the cabin altitude has stabilised and the differential pressure is within limits.